stream for Pathway 17. So why the name gender equity? And it's very simple. It's because equity leads to gender equality. Gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. There has been progress over the last decades. There are more girls going to school, fewer girls are forced into early marriage, more women are serving in parliament and positions of leadership, and laws are being reformed to advance gender equality. Despite these gains, there have been many challenges. For instance, discriminatory laws, social norms remain pervasive, women continue to be underrepresented at all levels of political leadership, and 1 in 5 women and girls between the ages of 15 and 49 report experiencing physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. Women's economic empowerment is considered to be a prerequisite for attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as for establishing rights and equitable societies. In today's session, we'll be exploring how one empowers rural women through entrepreneurship. I'm honored to introduce Jody Delichte as a guest panelist. Jody is a senior executive with over 25 years of experience leading global programs in the ICT and telecom sector for organizations such as HP, Verifone, Nortel Networks, and the GSMA, as well as co-founding and developing mobile and fintech startup companies. More recently, she has bridged the ICT and telecoms experience with her passion for development, ensuring the underserved are included digitally and financially and have access to life-enhancing value-added service in areas such as health, agriculture, utilities, and insurance. She has a global experience across 4 continents and currently specializes in Africa, livelihoods developing at the bottom of the pyramid. So I would like to thank you, Jody, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much for the great introduction, and thanks for everyone for joining the session today. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on 4.5 years of research that I conducted in Marsabit County in northern Kenya, which is close to the border of Ethiopia. So for those of you who don't know the area or have never had the opportunity to travel there, Marsabit County is a pastoralist community. So the primary activity there is really livestock herding. 83% of the people in Marsabit County live in absolute poverty, and about 68% of those people have no education. So there have been also increasing problems due to climate change. So over the course of the time that I was there, for example, I saw increasingly severe droughts, which led to a lot of livestock deaths, which of course has a big impact on a pastoralist community. So the program that I was studying aimed to improve the livelihoods and the resilience of pastoralists. So 3 years of this research was for my PhD, and then the additional research was for the organization that was responsible for the program. So over the 4.5 years that I went to Marsabit County 6 times, and each time I went for about 2 weeks. And I followed 51 people over the course of 4.5 years. So every time I went back, I would interview and observe the same people to look at how their perceptions and behaviors were changing over time. So the program itself was comprised mostly of women. There were men, but it was about 80% women. And so my study sample of 51 people had a similar breakdown. So it was about 82% of those were women. So just to give you a little bit of background on what this program was that I was studying, you're probably wondering what was this program? So the needy people in the community were already, before the program started, receiving a cash transfer from the government. So this cash transfer was about 5,400 shillings every 2 months. So in today's exchange rates, which I know are fluctuating wildly, that's about $44 US, right, every 2 months. So often these people would get the money and they would immediately spend that on food or other goods that they needed, and they would consume those quite rapidly, and then they would end up struggling until they once again receive the next payment within a couple of months. So the program targeted about 1,200 of those cash transfer beneficiaries. And what it did was it put them into savings groups of about 30 people per group. And they learned how to save some of that money that they were receiving. So they would make their regular contributions to the group. There were sort of 3 executives of the group, each of which would have a key to the safe box. I'm sure some of you are familiar with savings groups. And then once they had saved enough money, then they would be able to loan that money to individuals within the group for an interest rate, and then that would have to be paid on a certain time. So some of this was quite new concepts for people. So savings as a group, kind of loans, repayment, and even repayment within specified deadlines. These were sort of new concepts. And primarily it was women in the groups. There were some men that did participate in the groups, but sometimes even if the husband was the beneficiary of the cash transfer, he would often ask his wife to participate in the group because it tended to be more women, and often the men were sort of off with their livestock doing different things. So some of the more educated people in the community ended up being trained as community-based facilitators. So the young man standing against the tree there, and there's a woman, you can't quite see her so well, sitting against the tree, they're community-based facilitators. And they helped ensure that the groups functioned effectively, that people were following the rules and knew what they needed to do, and were attending the groups and repaying. They also trained the groups in topics such as life skills, so how to speak in front of the group, how to have more confidence and maybe be a little bit more assertive when needed. And also they trained them on basic business skills, so how to buy and sell goods for profit, right? So, and how to calculate profit and losses. So it's not just if you buy a goat and then 2 months later you sell that goat, that's your profit, because there may have been other things that you've spent money on for that goat. You know, you may have transported the goat somewhere and paid transportation costs, or may have had to buy food or medicine or something for that goat, right? So they had to learn some of these concepts about how you actually calculate these things. And often the community-based facilitators ended up having to keep records as well of the loans and the repayments in the group, because the group members were illiterate. Sometimes they would get school children to help them with this, but often it needed to be the community-based facilitator, because one of the other components of the program was loans from Equity Bank that they could then use to help them grow their businesses. And the groups that showed positive behaviors in terms of their loans and loan repayments could take these loans. They were individual loans that were backed by other group members. So the one other thing that the program did start doing, in addition to all of these other things, was some market linkages. So market linkages with suppliers and even buyers. So they started working on those types of things as well. So over time, I saw pretty much all my sample had started some kind of business, whether that was a petty trade of selling food items like sugar or tea leaves, or even soaps and things like that. Some of them started doing things with beads and beadworks, and some of them started livestock trading at the livestock markets. And then some further expanded to have their own kiosks and even guest houses. So over time, I saw women became more empowered in various ways. And I of course, had many opportunities to discuss with the women how they were changing and what was changing and why and how that was for them, which was really interesting. And one of the ways was through this knowledge and skills that they were gaining. So a lot of the women would talk to me about how, you know, they saw themselves as not being learned and being illiterate. And they now realize that they could learn new things, just like their children, some of their children who might be going to school, or, you know, other people who had some education that they didn't have. And they just said that they now felt more enlightened, and they could do things that they saw others doing, like doing business, buying and selling things, saving money. And some women told me that now they couldn't be taken advantage of anymore. There was one woman who said, you know, my husband used to give me 10 shillings and tell me it was 100 shillings. And now I know the difference. He can't take advantage of me anymore because I know how to count this money and I know what these different bills are. You know, and some women even said that they now know more than their husbands because they've been part of these groups, and they know about savings and loans and business, and their husbands don't know about any of this. So the other big thing was kind of this sense of independence and self-reliance that they didn't have before. You know, a lot of the women would tell me I used to have to sit and wait for my husband to bring me food, and me and the kids food. And some of these women would have 6, 8. One woman had 11 children, right? And sometimes these men have multiple wives and they're gone for long periods of time with their livestock. And the women had to wait for their husbands to bring food to them, and they were starving, and they would have to go and try to beg for food. As this one woman here, pictured here, said, she said, we're not as we used to be. Before, we were just waiting for the husband to bring food, and now we don't wait for him. They had their own money. They were making their own money. They could feed their children. They could pay school fees for their children. Often the kids were sent home from school because fees couldn't be paid, and now they could pay their school fees, and they didn't have to beg anymore. And a lot of women talked to me about this sense of pride that they now felt. Another big thing that is related is asset ownership, right? They were now able to own their own things. So in this community, often women, young girls were married off to older men. Keneilwe talked a bit about that just a minute ago. And when that husband passed away, the livestock would then go to his brother. The wife wouldn't get the livestock. So now they were able to buy their own livestock, either for trade or for themselves. There was one widow who was so excited when I saw her one day because she had finally bought her own goat. She owned her first goat, and she was so excited. She trekked me over to see her goat. And the next year I went and saw her. She had multiple goats, and she was very excited to show me those, right? So now she owned her own livestock, and the business goods that they were doing business with, whether that be sugar, soap, etc., those were their business goods. One woman told me, my husband tries to tell me what to do with my business products, and I tell him, no, he doesn't know what to do. I know what to do, and these are my business products, right? So now there was like a sense of ownership that they didn't have before, and even more household items, whether that was better tarps for the roofs of their huts, or mobile phones. I actually saw an increasing number of mobile phones over the 4.5 years that I spent there. And often at first they would have to go and maybe charge those in town, but then I started to see, especially later on, more solar panels, or small solar panels, like on the roofs of some of the huts or inside the huts, that they would use to charge their phones. So there was more ownership of items like that. The other thing which related to the other ones, and I've talked about this a little bit already, is more household decision-making, right? And financial management. As this one woman pictured here said, she said, women now have more control over decisions. Men can't control everything now. And this woman in particular, her husband had decided that their young daughter was going to get married off to an older man and sent her off with the older man. And this woman now sort of had the confidence to say, no, this isn't happening. And she trekked over to the older man's village and took her daughter back and brought her home. And so she now had the confidence to say, no, this is not happening to my daughter. I'm not having this. Women talked to me about how now they could make more decisions, again, because they had their own money, but make more decisions about what was going to happen with money in the household, in terms of saving, in terms of buying food, in terms of the school fees, for the children, right? So in some cases, the husbands were supportive and some of those decisions were made together. In other cases, some of the women said that they would, hide their money away from the husband so that they wouldn't take that money and, sometimes go and maybe drink more alcohol or chew more of some of the local drugs. So I'm not trying to say, obviously, that all men are bad, but there were, some of those instances where the women did feel that they needed to hide it from their husbands. So a real big change that was just absolutely lovely to see and just witness and experience along the journey with these women was their change in how they perceived themselves, and their confidence. This one woman pictured here, when I first met her, she talked to me about how she was never able to have children. Her husband had passed away. She was sort of shunned away by the other wives. She had no one to help her. She was starving. She had to beg for food all of the time, and through this program, she was able to do business. She actually became kind of very successful and quite hard-nosed in business. But, she said, I was illiterate before, and now I know what to do. And what I feel right now is that I'm a person too, and I have my own things as well. That I'm a person too. She felt like a human being. Often these women would talk to me about how they used to feel like like animals or just like a bug. And so this sense of actually just being a human, being a person, being part of the community was a huge thing for them. And also many talked to me about their now ability to talk to and interact with men. You know, they could go to the livestock market now and they could interact with men just as the men would. And they had more respect from other people because they weren't begging anymore. And you know, overall, I saw just generally more hope for the future and more aspirations. So things that they saw now could potentially be possible, or things that they wouldn't have even thought of before. They were now having different ideas as to things that they could do or things that they could sort of make happen. And the last one that I want to talk about is the connections and the roles in the community. So not only were they now more connected through their savings group, and the savings group members were there to help and support each other, but they were also more connected outside sort of their own small villages now. So they were going to the livestock market and interacting with more people. Some even started going sort of further afield to larger towns to do trade and buy goods in other towns and then bring it back to their villages to sell them. The groups were often asked to speak with governments that came to visit or other organizations that came to visit and share their experiences, their challenges, and the things that they needed. So they felt like they had more of a voice as well. And a lot of them started taking on new roles that perhaps were previously just held by men. Like this one woman pictured here talked about how before men had all the responsibilities, but now it's more balanced between men and women. So she actually now sits on the school committee and the borehole committee, which used to just be men on those committees. So we often hear or read about how, you know, empowering women improves the community overall, right? It sort of has more of an exponential effect. And it's definitely something that I saw over the course of the 4.5 years. You know, I already talked about kind of the school fees and the women now being able to pay school fees, which was very important for them. And you know, so more children would be able to stay in school and go to school and stay in school for longer because they were able to pay those school fees either through money they were earning through their business or their savings, or, you know, sometimes they needed to take a loan from their savings group to help them pay school fees, but now they had that support structure. And also, I already mentioned that they were able to better feed their children. So there was more nutrition for the children and also better access to medical services. So if they needed medical care, they now were making money through their businesses and saving money to be able to pay for medical services when it was needed, or again, take loans from their savings group if that was needed. And the other thing is sort of greater climate resilience. And this sort of has a few different aspects. So one, because they were had learned how to save, they were then able to kind of weather some of the shocks a bit better than previously. And also they were learning how to do that. So let's say, for example, they have a bunch of livestock and they see a drought sort of coming. You can start to see the signs of it. They were taught about how to then sell the livestock before they die off. And then save the money and then repurchase livestock sort of once the drought is over. The other things associated with climate resilience are around environmental degradation. So prior to this program, many of the women were perhaps going out to utilize the natural resources or collect natural resources for different things just to try to get something for food. Right. So that could be cutting leaves to make brooms, or it could be burning charcoal, or just trying to collect whatever wood that they could find to then exchange that for food to be used for firewood. So it degraded the environment around them. And now they were able to make money through other means, right? Through buying and selling sugar, livestock, etc. So that was not only less physically taxing for them. A lot of them had talked to me about just how difficult those types of jobs were physically, but it was also better for the environment. And a number of the women I talked to had started actually participating in committees to reduce and protect environmental degradation and help protect the environment around them. And, you know, overall, there's now sort of more role models for girls. And I realize I put here more role models for girls in terms of, you know, seeing women doing these things, but I think it's also more role models for boys as well, right? In terms of how boys then interact with women and maybe respect women in a different way than they had previously. So just to kind of finish off, I saw a number of the women improve in their businesses over time. The woman in the top right there, she ended up building a kiosk close to her home. The woman in the bottom built a guest house. So they kind of started growing their businesses to even a greater degree. But many of the women still continued to sell goods out of their huts. Like the woman in the top left, she sold different goods out of her huts, and over time, the number of and types of goods ended up increasing. And this woman actually, before I had met her, she had lost one of her legs in an accident. So she only had one leg. So she sent someone to town to collect goods for her, and then she would sell them from her hut. So I saw different examples of disabled women, disabled in different ways, that were benefiting and becoming more empowered through entrepreneurship, which I think was a great thing to see as well. So I just want to leave you with a quote that I think embodies some of the changes that I saw and summarizes everything really well. And this is what one woman told me. She said, "The business has really changed me. I can now buy new clothes for myself and my kids. I can do anything I want at any time. And above all, my children have something to eat. I now feel more part of the community than before." And I think that kind of summarizes everything that I was just talking about. So I'll finish there, but if anyone wants to read more about this, I wrote a series of blogs and some different reports that are on the FSD Kenya website. And you can just search for me as an author, or the link is there. So I shall leave it there.
Thank you so much, Jody, for this wonderful presentation. I mean, this has been a great study, and I'm glad to see like how so many women have benefited from this. And truly, knowledge is power. And just before we just get into our Q&A section, I just want to encourage everybody who's on the call, do ask questions. We are here to answer them. And just like I was saying before, knowledge is power. And with power comes more challenges that we have seen. Just from the time you did the study to now, are there any challenges that they are facing?
Yeah, I've worked on and with different programs that empower women in different ways. And I think, one of the things that we need to be cognizant of with these types of programs is some of the unintended consequences. And especially in communities where it is a male-dominated community, and they're not necessarily used to such a change where women are now speaking out or doing their own thing. And, some men were more accepting and supportive than others, and some perhaps became maybe more abusive because they didn't like that the women were now, more empowered, right? So it can sometimes lead to more abuse. And sometimes when more money comes into the household, there are instances where that may result in the male of the household drinking more alcohol or taking more of the local drugs, which can then obviously create a series of problems. Fortunately, over the time I was there were other programs that were addressing some of the abusive women in the community. So that was being alleviated in some instances, but I do think that is something that takes time.
Thank you for that, Jody. And I mean, as you've mentioned, it's very important that we are cognizant and aware about the effects. And sometimes something good can eventually have a negative effect. And it's all about how do we balance this whole notion of between culture and empowerment. And just to ask just the next question, what may be next in terms of increasing empowerment and growth through their businesses?
Yeah, so what I saw over time was, the women in their villages would start a business. Let's say one woman starts selling sugar and tea leaves. And then another woman will say, "Oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to sell sugar and tea leaves." So there were a lot of copycat businesses, which it's great that they're doing business, but they're all trying to sell sugar and tea leaves to each other. So there needs to be kind of some more diversification, some different kind of ideas coming in and things that they can do, and probably even more external linkages. So like I said, the program that I was working with and studying was starting to work on external linkages, which they get, if you're selling livestock at the livestock market, you are getting buyers coming in from other places like Nairobi, for example, right? But then there can be some other external linkages. So they're not just kind of selling within their own community, especially if they're trying to sell similar things. So I think that's kind of some of the next things that need to be addressed and thought about.
Okay, thank you so much, Jody, for that. And yes, I mean, there are differences also among women about who wants to sell what, who wants to sell what. And I know that there is a lot of competition, experiencing it in South Africa, and how the township is. You find that at a corner, there's somebody selling the same thing and the same thing. And at the end, not really anybody in the community is progressing, because you are probably the same thing over and over again. So it's good to be able, I think, to identify different opportunities for them. And I know there's something that we always touch on when it comes to gender. It's good that with the community, they're working with different programs. There are programs maybe for sexual harassment and abuse. There's this program that you have there. What would you basically say is like, how do we make sure that all these programs are working together?
Yeah, I would like, ideally, I would love to see more kind of collaboration or just kind of cross information between some of the programs. So one of the challenges that I did see sort of in the community was that there were, some programs that were just like sort of giving things away. And then this program was trying to kind of empower women through business, right? So I'm not going to say all 51 of the sample and the 82% of women within that sample all ended up kind of progressing equally, because that's not the case, and it never would be anyway, right? But because people progress in different ways, and we're humans, we're all different. But some of the challenges were, with where there were these programs that were maybe giving things away, some of the women would go, well, why should I like make this effort and try to run a business, because I can get things for free from this other place, and, some of the women would say, whatever you gave them, they would make the most of it. And others would say, no, I can get things for free. Right. So and there were a lot of different programs in this area and more that came up while I was there. Right. And I just think, just better communication and coordination across the programs to really sort of look at kind of how to best help the people in the community together instead of potentially working against each other. I'm not saying they all work against each other, but there is that potentiality of them working against each other in some ways.
Yeah. All right. No, thank you so much, Jody, for the session. It has been a brilliant one, understanding and seeing what this program has done for many women and the benefits when we do invest in women and empowering them. So thank you so much, Jody, for this wonderful session. It has been such a privilege and an honor to chat to you today.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jody.
All right.